In the 1st century AD, the greatest power on earth was Rome. With power, as always, came splendor and languor. This is a reconstruction of a villa at Herculaneum, seaside retreat of the imperial equivalent of multimillionaires. Rome itself was in many ways a reconstruction of Greece, a nation it had conquered and absorbed. Its architecture was Greek, and so, under different names, were its gods, with a special Roman emphasis on sensuality. The master and mistress, rather ordinary people, but the fashion that they followed in Herculaneum and nearby Pompeii was tainted by cruelty and violence. And in 79 AD came a violent end to their world. Vesuvius exploded. To the archaeologists of a far distant future, Pompeii's destruction has meant preservation. 200 years of patient digging have revealed a frozen moment in the life of Rome. Even closer to the volcano, in Herculaneum, a layer of lava 20 meters deep has been removed. Now shops and houses stand almost as fresh as the day before the eruption. You might be in Herculaneum 2,000 years ago, except for one thing. There are no people. There have never been any remains of people. It was a mystery that lasted until 1982, when the archaeologists began to dig in Herculaneum's boat tunnels. Tunnels facing a beach that was also buried, before the coast was reformed half a mile to the west. And there they were. By the hundreds, they had left their civilization to the lava and had sheltered here, only to die in a blast of scalding gas. A woman is preserved forever in the act of protecting her child. But why would people build cities on the sides of volcanoes? Perhaps civilization in itself makes humans feel invulnerable to the forces of nature. But it's exactly these forces that have made civilizations what they are. All civilizations. The same thing that made Vesuvius made Rome. Colliding continents. As you vastly increase the time scale, you can begin to see how fluid the Earth's land masses are. 20 million years ago, the continents looked like this. Africa lay further south, and the boot of Italy was upright. Then, as Africa edged north, the boot swung back, creating a ridge of crumpled mountains and a chain of volcanoes erupting down their western side. Rome was built on foundations laid by the Greeks, and their geology was different. That first of the two great Mediterranean civilizations grew up in a mountainous land, deeply dissected by fingers of sea. Greece is being stretched apart, and only about a fifth of the land is level enough to be cultivated. As long as the population remains small, that doesn't matter. But once it passes a certain level, this geography dictates change. In 800 BC, Delphi was no more than a herdsman's shrine. The golden treasures of the Bronze Age kings were almost forgotten, little more than legends in epic poems. 300 years later, it was the center of the greatest civilization the world had ever seen. Greece had given birth to Europe's theater, philosophy, and geometry, not to mention concepts such as tyrant and tragedy. In the sacred grove were treasuries filled with precious gifts from all round the Mediterranean shores. The shrine at Delphi was dedicated to the god Apollo, patron of music, the arts, law, order, and in general, the finest instincts of humankind. Here, chariot races were held in his honor, the climax of the athletic games that gave us the Olympics. What had caused the transformation? Greece's population had passed the point where it could be supported by its arable land. The threat of poverty and the accessible sea conspired to send the Greeks out around the Mediterranean to search for new land and new raw materials. This meant the trade and colonization which inspired and enriched their own culture, the culture that they were to carry to the shores of Europe as the glorious civilization whose remnants we know. In the Mediterranean, it's possible to go virtually anywhere by following the coastlines, and that is how the Greeks steered. And up the western coastline of Italy, the first good sheltered anchorages are in the Bay of Naples. There, on the island of Ischia, in 770 BC, the Greek sailors founded a trading post. In the graves, where they left behind their comrades, was a wine cup. Scratched on it is one of the earliest Greek poems ever found, dating from a time when the language was still written from right to left. Nestor had a most drink-worthy cup, but whoever drinks from this cup will soon be smitten with desire for fair-crowned Aphrodite, the goddess of love. They considered wine an aphrodisiac, or hoped it would be. Beside the bay is Mount Vesuvius. That the Greeks chose not to settle on the mainland had nothing to do with respect for smouldering volcanoes, but rather fear of the warlike locals. Anyway, Ischia, where they landed, is a volcano. In fact, volcanoes, far from deterring settlement, actually attract it. Today, people still live on the slopes of Vesuvius, where they grow the grapes for the same high-quality wines that presumably were drunk in that ancient cup. Because volcanic ash its minerals fresh from inside the earth, is very fertile. And when the Greeks arrived on Ischia, those soils were already supporting the beginnings of the civilization on the mainland. The mainlanders built their huts where the volcanic soils fed them, and their minerals and metalwork were to make them wealthy. Bronze, an alloy of tin and copper, was why the Greeks had settled on Ischia at all. They wanted as much as they could get, and these shadowy people of the volcanic mainland, the Etruscans, were happy to supply it. Early civilizations advanced with their metallurgical skills, and the Greeks were already masters of iron. They brought the ore from another volcanic island, Elba, and on Ischia they smelted it. Even a whole day in a simple furnace being blown by a bellows wasn't enough to melt the ore, only to reduce it to a workable, sponge-like bloom. The furnace having cooled, the bloom could be lifted out. Then came the kind of skilled technology that civilizations sometimes rest on, the slow and laborious process of smithing, heating the bloom over and over again and repeatedly tapping out the slag. The purity of the iron increased until finally it could be shaped into a tool. But even that was only halfway to the finished metalwork. One reason that iron was so important was its use in shaping the much more sought-after metal, bronze. The Greeks were better at bronze work than the Etruscans, but the Etruscans had the raw material. So there was a busy trade with the mainland. Bronze, other metals, foodstuffs, for some of the most prized commodities in Europe, fine Greek armor and pottery. In those days, armor made the man. The heroes Ajax and Achilles keep their spears and helmets at hand, even as they play a game of dice. Again, it was the northward drift of Africa, the bending of the Italian boot, and the resulting volcanoes that deserved credit. For it was the volcanoes that enriched the metal ores like the soil, and the resulting trade with the Greeks made the Etruscans rich and produced these strange mounds. Villages grew into cities, and graveyards came to look like towns. A mark of a civilization with prosperity to spare is the Grand Tomb. These final resting places, carved out of solid volcanic rock at Cairo, appear to be as spacious and comfortable as their owners' houses. The vaults, filled with art and various objects for the enjoyment of the afterlife, could serve the same family for 150 years. The decor derives not only from Greece, but from cultures as far away as the Black Sea and the Middle East, fashions brought to Italy along with the Mediterranean trade that thrived in the 6th century BC. A departed couple were immortalized on their coffin, serene in their contemplation of the good life to come. Their wines and perfumes, imported of course from Greece, were sold in expensive pots, the best of which came from Corinth. In the Etruscan heartland, between the Tiber and Arno rivers, there were now many independent cities made rich by trade. And the richest of all was the one that dominated the coast where the ships landed first, Cairo. Corinth had become a trading capital because it sat on a thin neck of land between northern and southern Greece. It was much safer to carry valuable goods through Corinth than to ship them around the stormy headlands of the Peloponnese. The Greek landscape had been created by pressures that tore and tilted the continental crust, and at Corinth, limestones were pushed up from under the sea. Formed from shells and other organic detritus, limestone is easy to quarry and cut, and Corinthians used it to build a new kind of temple to Apollo, the god that had blessed them with an isthmus. Single columns of stone, rather than wood, were used as pillars. This could have been the ostentation of one of the world's wealthiest cities, or it could have been the only choice if the local forests had already been cut down. Fashion spread easily from this channel of world trade, and soon many of the Greek colonies around the Mediterranean were building all-stone temples. The splendor and size of structures, such as this one at Paestum in Italy, reflects a wealth and vigor in the outposts as great as any in Greece itself. Sicily, Mount Etna. As ever, a volcano means fertile soil. Etna attracted Greek farmers, and throughout history, farmers have fed merchants, and merchants build cities. Taormina, Megara Hybla, Syracuse. Independent, proud city-states, each then had its own laws and army. This was the brave new world of the 6th century BC. By the end of that century, the Etruscans had expanded in the only direction where there were no Greeks, northwards, and the Greeks had spread their cultural empire virtually everywhere along the northern and eastern shores of the Mediterranean, and even around the Black Sea. Separate city-states tied together by language and commerce. The Phoenicians of Carthage, also great traders, had colonized the southwestern shores and were rivals of the Greeks, while the Near East was dominated by the Empire of Babylon. The principal attraction to Greek settlement was always the main thing they lacked at home: fertile farmland. In Athens, corn became so important that wages were paid in it, and the early coins of some cities upheld the value of grain. Two of the most appeased of the Greek deities, to whom farmers gave these clay tablets, were the goddess of the earth's fruits, Demeter, and the god who had taught men to make wine, Dionysus, the central figure of the year's main celebrations. These rituals were no less important for being wild and dissolute. Dionysus, with his lazy, lascivious satyrs, represented the chaotic vitality of nature, the equal and opposite of the world of the civilized and disciplined sun god Apollo. But sometimes Apollo did make inroads. And at intellectual Athens, men would gather to accompany their wine drinking with music and fashionable philosophical discussion. Nevertheless, the point always did arrive when everyone was drunk and tried to throw wine from one cup to another. But what beautiful cups. Like the wine, the oils and the perfumes, fine pottery was a leading export, and this quality a cause of Athens' rapid rise, not just to riches, but to predominance among Greek cities. The main importers were the Etruscans. Their parties were more in the true spirit of Dionysus. At least there were women at them, the white figures in these tomb paintings at Tarquinia. An empire that is purely cultural and commercial is as good a way as any for bringing prosperity home. But in the early 5th century BC, fierce economic competition among independent cities began to look more like dangerous disunity, while another kind of empire was looming in the east. It very quickly became the greatest empire the world had ever known. It belonged to the Persians, who from their capital, Persepolis, conquered all the land from the Indus to the Mediterranean. Until now, the Bosphorus Seaway, a piece of geographical good fortune, had protected the Westerners. This time, though, the Persian ruler Xerxes had other ambitions. He commanded that the Bosphorus be bridged. It was to be the world's first great pontoon bridge, made with 674 ships. Xerxes' army, drawn from 46 nations, 250,000 men and 75,000 animals marched across it. It took a week. At the same time, 1,000 Persian warships sailed around the coast. The only Greek city that could even hope to put up a fight was Athens. But even the Athenian navy was outnumbered 10 to 1. At times like these, the Greeks always consulted the oracle of Apollo at Delphi, where a priestess in a trance was thought to speak the god's words. "Pray to the winds," she said. They prayed, and a great storm blew up and demolished 400 of the Persian ships. The storm wasn't the Athenians' only godsend. Millions of years before, there had been some lucky geology too. One almost insignificant byproduct of the formation of the Alps by the colliding continents had been the concentration of seams of silver in the hills of Attica. For many years before the Persian invasion, Athens had had slaves at work mining these. But 3 years before, a particularly rich seam had been discovered. The slaves were mostly prisoners of war, and there were almost as many of them as there were free citizens of the Athenian democracy. They worked in terrible conditions, in tiny hand-cut shafts. But it was thanks to their toil and this ore that Greece and ultimately Western civilization were saved. With the silver, Athens bought a new fleet. By this time, the Greek cities had formed an alliance, and its leader, Themistocles, persuaded the Athenians to have 200 triremes built. Powered by 3 tiers of oarsmen who were volunteers, these ships were the world's most advanced weapons of war. Still, as the Greek warriors said goodbye to their families, they could only have felt deep pessimism. The quarrelsome cities could not agree on a coordinated defense, and only a tiny force of Spartans under King Leonidas rode to challenge the Persians at the pass of Thermopylae, the last place they could conceivably be stopped. Leonidas had a royal escort of 300, leading an army of just 7,000 men. The Greeks were outnumbered by 100 to 1. They held out for 2 days, and they all died. Now nothing stood between Xerxes and Athens. Before the Persians arrived, the Athenians fled. They had left a guard around the Acropolis, but that wasn't going to stop the Persian army. And that night, the soldiers climbed the cliffs and looted the golden treasures of the Temple of Athena. Another piece of advice that the Athenians had got from the oracle was to trust to your wooden walls. And as the Persians sailed to the attack, the Athenians had only their triremes left to trust in. Triremes were essentially oar-powered torpedoes. The object was to sink the enemy ship by ramming it. The investment paid off. The Athenians won. Ships were capsized. The waves could not be seen. Smothered in shattered wrecks of human flesh, on shores and rocks, dead men were crowded thick. From end to end in all the fleet of Asia, the rowers turned to panic and retreat. Without its fleet, the Persian army was stranded and soon defeated. The concept of democracy was saved by silver. The deity to whom the Greeks gave thanks was Nike, the winged goddess of victory. This left the Mediterranean with a new supreme power, Athens. The city led a league of 220 other Greek cities, which paid Athens to build more ships and raise more troops to mop up the remaining Persians still scattered around the Aegean. But the Persians sued for peace early, and there was money to spare. The Athenians used this defense dividend to build a temple to their patroness, Athena Parthenos, the Virgin, the Parthenon. Inside, the goddess's gigantic statue was made of ivory and half a ton of gold. It represented riches of a degree that the Greeks had never before imagined. Only 3 centuries since poor towns, isolated in small valleys or on rugged islands, had gone to sea to look for farmland, the peaks of Mount Parnassus had become the backdrop for the pinnacle of human culture and wealth. And one city in particular was immensely rich, powerful, and arrogant. To the other cities, now that the Persians were gone, this seemed at the very least unnecessary. The brash colonial cities in particular tried to outspend and outbuild Athens. The Temple of Neptune at Paestum in Italy. The great power source of the time was slavery, and it was from that pool of energy that the temples rose, massively financed because the temples were also the state treasuries. And as the architecture piled up, so did civic pride. Jealousy, fear, overspending, and greed broke out. And war. Athens, meanwhile, got on with its golden age. In 438 BC, the Parthenon was finally finished. Athene was the goddess of wisdom and patroness of intellectual debate. But she was also goddess of Athens and goddess of war. On the Acropolis there was a temple to Victory, adorned with bronze warriors, the epitome of masculine virtue. As far as the Athenians were concerned, their state was invincible. War only meant victory, and victory meant glory. Athens came to be characterized as much by militarism as by reason. In the end, reason lost. Throughout Greece, the temples, which doubled as banks, were making loans, not, as traditionally, to beautify the cities, but to build fortifications, as this plaque, a sort of bronze ledger, records. Cities hid behind walls, like these at Agostina. No sooner had Athens completed the enormously expensive Parthenon than it began squandering money, not to mention energy, talent, and life, on a pointless war with Sparta, its neighbor. And there were ambitious overseas adventures. The Athenians tried to capture Syracuse, the main Greek city on Sicily. They failed. They lost their fleet and cut off from their colonies. They also lost their supply of grain, the very reason they had ever set sail in the first place. Everywhere fortune soured. The Etruscans had sided with the Persians, and now they were defeated as a nation. Greeks fought Greeks, and city fought city. Suddenly, less than a generation after the glorious defeat of Xerxes, the prosperity that had been brought to the Mediterranean by trade had been transformed by conflict into poverty and famine. It was the end of the Mediterranean as the world of the Greeks, but it wasn't the end of the Mediterranean world. 500 years later, built around the same sea on the same resources, it was the world of the Romans. What had happened? The Roman Empire was not so much a culture as a state. Its epicenter was the Forum. But when the triumphant armies marched up the Via Sacra to the Forum, they marched above the ruins of an older Rome. When Nero built the city's huge granaries, he built them over the underground slave quarters of his political enemies' villas, which he had watched burn. And beneath them are earlier buildings, Etruscan. Rome sat on Etruscan foundations. The arches that seem so typically Roman were, in fact, an Etruscan invention. Even the bronze statue of the wolf suckling Romulus and Remus, Rome's legendary founders, is Etruscan. In a sense, the Etruscans gave birth to Rome, while the Greeks fathered the new power. But Rome was able to rise where they had collapsed. It could be pragmatism. The Roman leaders, who had themselves immortalized in sculpture, warts and all, were realists. They were hard men who could forge an empire where none had existed before. By 100 BC, the Romans had taken the entire Italian peninsula from the remnants of the Etruscans and Greeks, and Spain and North Africa from the Carthaginians. But there was a part of the world where Rome held no more sway than any other Mediterranean power ever had. To the north. Beyond the maritime Alps stood Europe and the fortifications of barbarian Gaul. Rocca-Perturs, a barbarian sacred site. Civilization means a society with cities, which are thought to confer certain refinements on a culture. The Romans were civilized in that they were citified, and they even embraced a few refinements, though they were bloodthirsty enough. But the barbarians were uncivilized in every sense of the word. They not only cut off their enemies' heads, but at the Rocca-Perturs temple, they nailed them into niches on the door. The battles between barbarians and Romans were fierce, but on balance, the civilized warriors beat what they viewed as naked savages and forced their way north. Among the first of the barbarian superstitions to disappear was the belief that charms around their necks would make them invulnerable. They still wore them as they were led away into slavery. The Romans could now settle in Gaul. To their first province, still called Provence, they brought the culture that had begun in Greece. But now they traveled overland. For the first time, European civilization was spreading by road instead of sea. Now it could penetrate the heart of Europe. The Roman urge was to keep pushing north, towards new territory, new resources, a new supply of slaves. But between the Romans and those riches was a frustrating barrier, the Alps. Mountains were thought at least to be the realm of the gods. Whatever they were certainly not the place for Romans. And what lay beyond the mountains, if indeed the mountains ever stopped, was anyone's guess. It was bound to make the soldiers grumble, being wetter and colder than Italy, with more severe seasons. But the same continental forces that had thrown up the Alps and created mountains as high as Mont Blanc had also made a way of passing around them. Like much of the more extreme geography of Europe, the Alps were a result of the northward drift of Africa. And as they rose, a split in the crust formed on the western side of the mountains, causing volcanoes to erupt and subside. This rift became the valleys of the Rhone and the Rhine. But as the Romans were coming up from Italy, the traffic on these natural highways was running heavily southwards. Hordes of Teutonic barbarians were pouring out of northern Europe, destroying towns and countryside, and threatening Rome itself. The Romans met them here, beneath Mont Saint-Victoire, and killed 100,000. They captured another 100,000 as slaves, a bonanza of free labor. Slavery, added to the volcanic fertility of the Italian fields, created a wealth in wine, much of which was shipped back up the Rhone and sold to some of the same barbarians who had provided the stock of slaves. In Roman eyes, they are exceedingly fond of wine and sate themselves on the unmixed wine imported by merchants. Their desire makes them drink it greedily, and when they become drunk, they fall into a stupor or a maniacal disposition. And therefore many Italian merchants, with their usual love of cash, look on the Gallic craving for wine as their treasure. The wine would be filtered, bottled in pottery amphorae, and loaded onto sailing ships bound for the mouth of the Rhone, the gateway to northern Europe. Three-quarters of the Italian export was wine, and as it flowed north, it drew the Romans with it, expanding their influence beyond the Alps. Shipping was a high-risk trade then, and the rugged coasts were lined with hazards. The vessels were heavily loaded. This wreck of a comparatively small boat at the mouth of the Rhone holds 400 tons of cargo, including 6,000 20-litre wine amphorae. To lose such a shipload would have been a serious setback, for wine could be traded at a rate of 1 amphora for 1 slave, a price the barbarians were prepared to pay. For wine, they would fight each other and capture each other on behalf of the Roman slave force. And the more slaves there were in Italy, the more wine flowed up the Rhone. The Rhone is still a busy link between the Mediterranean and northern Europe, carrying 3.5 million tons of cargo every year. And what the river doesn't actually carry, it accompanies through its valley, and in the case of the high-speed train, it drives. The train runs on the Rhone's hydroelectric power. The trade route that was the conduit of wine to the barbarians carries freight by road, gas and oil by pipeline. It is still a vital artery in the economy of Europe. In Roman times, products, of course, moved down the river too. They came out of the dark, cold, unknown forests, collectively known as Gaul. Hides, woolen goods, salt pork, pitch, resin, honey, amber, tin. Some of the barbarian tribes made almost as much profit from the trade as the Romans did. But other, unheard-of tribes kept emerging from the shelter of the forests to use the Rhone as a way into the Roman province. The Romans may not always have been entirely aware of what they had tapped into. Trade and migration had been following these waterways since the Stone Age. Many great rivers, including tributaries of the Rhone, flowed out of the European highlands. For several millennia, there had been known positions of power where access to rivers could be controlled. One of these was Bibracte, a fortified settlement with a view on one side of the streams that fed the Rhone, and on the other of the Seine. Whoever controlled Bibracte, and this had been true since the Stone Age, could make a fortune by taxing the goods from the boats and pack animals. In the 1st century BC, this was the Aedui tribe, one of the strongest in Gaul, and made stronger when the Roman trade appeared. To keep that flourishing, they made an alliance with the Romans. Bibracte was a fortress on a mountaintop. Surrounding it was a great rampart, 5 kilometers long, once a massive earthwork strengthened with timber beams. Since 1984, an international team of archaeologists have been excavating this vast settlement, centimeter by centimeter, analyzing it. What is emerging is a picture of a time of change. By shipping wine up the rivers, the Romans were, in a sense, civilizing the barbarians, by making commerce more rewarding than military prowess. One thing is certain, Bibracte was a center not only of the wine trade, but of wine consumption. The ground is thick with broken amphorae. Other barbarians naturally became envious of the Aedui, and the outcome of the envy was only ever one thing. Tribes from the Rhine attacked. The Romans came to their allies' aid. Centurions went to work strengthening the fortifications. Their commander, fresh from securing Roman control of the passes to the Rhone and anxious to make a reputation as a great soldier, was one Julius Caesar. The defense of Bibracte was one more engagement on the way to conquering all of Gaul. But Caesar wasn't the only warrior who wanted Gaul. To the west was Vercingetorix, the chief of the main tribe of the Auvergne. Once again, volcanic soils had brought fertility, wealth, and power to his people. He resented the Roman presence in his country and dreamed of driving the centurions back to their own peninsula. To many of the Gauls, the problem was becoming urgent. Caesar's conquests already stretched as far as Brittany. The tribal leaders gathered and implored Vercingetorix to command a united Gallic army against Caesar. In 52 BC, Caesar returned to Bibracte, and from there rallied his legions. Vercingetorix and his warriors were camped at Alesia nearby. The Romans marched there, laid siege for a month, and began the greatest battle of all. The tribes lost, and Rome controlled Gaul all the way to the Rhine. Vercingetorix was captured, displayed as a trophy on Caesar's triumphant return to Rome, and executed. Caesar himself became dictator of Rome, and 4 years later was murdered in the Forum. Julius Caesar was not the first Roman emperor. His nephew Augustus became that, after consolidating his uncle's conquests. The ruins of a monument at La Turbie on the road from Rome to Provence records Augustus's homage and gratitude. Engraved on it are the names of the tribes that fell as the Roman Empire triumphed. By the end of the 1st century AD, Rome had replaced Athens as the greatest city the world had ever seen. And Roman culture had spread over areas of the world that the Greeks hadn't known existed. The Roman peace and prosperity stretched from the Bosphorus to Gibraltar, Brittany to the Rhine, Africa to Scotland. But Roman power was doomed by the very force that created it, constant expansion. The city needed a perpetual supply of fresh bounty, more slaves, more resources. The length of the boundaries of the empire grew to 16,000 kilometers, more than its armies could defend. And the time came, finally, when the barbarians broke through. In the same year that Vesuvius buried Pompeii, Roman slaves finished building the Colosseum, a monument to the power of civilization to transform a region's resources into artifacts of human culture. Roman culture still survives in our cities, our languages, our civilization. Rome fell, but it left a foundation north of the Alps on which Europe itself would be constructed.